The GPS was already lying. Sam knew it, but he followed it anyway. Maybe it was the fatigue from 3 nights on the road, or the fact that this run paid double. The dispatcher's voice still echoed in his head. Just follow the route, Sam. Lumber mills out past county line. GPS has the update. There was no reason to doubt. At first, as the sky faded from deep blue to black, and the last radio station fizzled into static, Sam realized he hadn't seen another car in over an hour. His rig's headlights cut a path down a narrow, winding road he didn't recognize. On both sides, trees pressed close, oaks, pines, and something he didn't recognize, their trunks pale and smooth, almost glowing. He glanced at the GPS again. Continue for 6 miles, it said, the voice chipper and robotic, but the line on the map didn't match any of the old routes he knew by heart. Sam reached for his thermos, hoping hot coffee would burn away the unease growing in his gut. He sipped, eyes flicking from the narrow shoulder to the dash, watching for signs of wildlife or sudden curves. The road kept snaking deeper, and the trees, he swore, were leaning closer than before. It felt like driving through a tunnel made of bark and branches. He tried to blame the feeling on exhaustion. He thumbed the old paper atlas, lying on the passenger seat. The route wasn't on any map. He found the town, Mill Creek, but the GPS said he was already miles past it, winding through what should have been solid forest. No way, he muttered. This can't be right. His phone had no bars, no signal, not even enough juice for a text. The silence settled in his cab like a heavy fog. He fiddled with the radio, hoping to catch a distant signal. Only static, then a voice, warped and faint. Can you hear? Before dissolving again. He flicked it off, drumming his fingers on the wheel. He set it arms perfected with cigarettes. His headlights flashed over a battered mailbox at the side of the road, the metal bent and twisted, barely visible through the weeds. He made a note of it, thinking he might need to double back, but the GPS insisted, and Sam kept going. The digital road ahead showed nothing but a green ribbon through endless black. The dashboard clock blinked 11:41. He pressed onward, hoping for a break in the woods, or a sign that he was still headed somewhere real. After what felt like 20 minutes, the road curved hard left, then right, then left again. Each time the branches arched lower, brushing the top of his trailer. He shivered. He was used to remote runs, but this felt different. The forest was too quiet, not even the chirp of crickets or a distant owl, only the hum of his engine, the rattle of cargo straps, and the distant thump of his own heart. His eyes darted back to the GPS as it chirped, "Turn right." He squinted at the road ahead. There was no turn, only the same 2-lane blacktop, winding deeper into a sea of trunks and tangled underbrush. But then, almost as if conjured, a dirt track appeared on the right, narrow and muddy. Against every instinct, he eased the truck onto it, tires crunching over stones and broken twigs. As he rolled forward, the headlights caught something hanging from a branch, a child's shoe swinging in the night breeze. Sam's chest tightened. He sped up, not daring to stop, heart pounding in his ears. The GPS continued to chatter, continue for 3 miles. The map was a blur of lines, and his sense of direction twisted into knots. He reached for the CB radio, pressing the button with white-knuckled fingers. Breaker, breaker, anybody on this stretch near Mill Creek? Static. He tried again, voice cracking a little. This is Lone Star. Anyone got ears on? Only silence answered him. The road seemed to narrow with every mile, tree trunks inching closer, some so near he could see the grooves and knots in the bark, the moss hanging like tattered cloth. A shape darted across the beams, maybe a deer, maybe not. He swerved slightly, breathing hard, forcing his mind to focus. He checked his mirrors. In the dim glow of his running lights, Branches scraped the side of the trailer, hissing like whispers in the dark. He strode whispers in the dark. He couldn't shake the feeling that the trees weren't just close, they were pressing in, squeezing the road tighter. Sam rubbed his eyes. Just a bad stretch. Get through it, and it'll open up. He passed the same battered mailbox again. This time it was closer to the road, weeds curling around the post like grasping fingers. Sam slammed the brakes, heart pounding. He stared at the mailbox, at the half-hidden numbers worn away by time and weather. He checked the GPS. The map spun, recalculating, then pointed him forward again. He gripped the wheel, every muscle tense, and kept driving. The cab felt smaller, the air thick with the smell of pine and something sour underneath. The GPS voice repeated itself, tinny and insistent, continue for 2 miles. But Sam already knew, somehow, that no matter how far he went, he wasn't leaving these woods. He took another sip of coffee, hands shaking, eyes locked on the road, as the trees pressed ever closer, the night growing impossibly dark and silent around him. Sam's hands ached from gripping the wheel, knuckles white in the weak glow of the dashboard. He slowed as the road seemed to pitch and buckle, roots and stones jutting up in places where there hadn't been any before. He leaned forward, eyes straining for a break in the wall of trees, for any sign of the night opening up. But it only closed tighter around him. The headlights pierced a tunnel of shifting trunks, every one of them standing too straight, too tall, leaning in, as if to listen. He glanced again at the GPS. The display flickered, the green route pulsing. Continue straight, the voice repeated, but the usual chipper tone was gone, replaced with something hollow, a flatness that made Sam shudder. He hit the screen. It glitched, then stabilized, but now the map looked off. The lines curved in a tight spiral, circling over themselves, and Sam realized he'd been here before, recently. The same rut in the pavement, the same twisted tree with an old tire nailed to it, the same mailbox, its numbers blurred by shadow. He pressed the brake, coming to a full stop. In the stillness, he killed the engine and listened. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. He could almost feel eyes on him, from the upper branches, from somewhere just outside the reach of the lights. His breath fogged the glass, and in the condensation he caught a flicker, just a moment, of something moving behind his reflection, long and spindly. He turned quickly. Only trees. But he left the engine off a few moments longer, gathering courage, trying to decide if he should back up, turn around, or just sit until daylight. The silence pressed against the cab. He switched the engine back on, more for comfort than anything, and the radio blared sudden static, so loud he flinched. He twisted the knob, and the static ebbed, replaced by a garbled voice. Sam, you then nothing, just wind. He froze. He hadn't told anyone his route. He hadn't spoken his name into the radio, trying to ignore the crawling feeling up his spine. Sam tried the phone again, still no bars. Even the emergency screen wouldn't load. He stared at it, willing it to change, to show some sign of civilization, or a signal, but the display stayed stubbornly blank, casting a sickly light over his palm. He tried to turn the rig around, but the shoulder was a muddy pit, and as he eased the wheel, the truck listed dangerously, tires spinning in the muck. He straightened up, unwilling to risk getting stuck out here for real. Ahead, the branches scraped the hood, tapping a gentle, persistent rhythm that made him think of fingers drumming. He blinked, jaw tight, and put the truck in drive. Continue straight. The GPS was back, the words looping, growing louder with every repetition. Continue straight. Sam shouted back at it, shut up, and smacked the screen. The display glitched again, the rote spinning in dizzying circles before freezing on a single word. recalculating. He kept moving. The lights caught things between the trees, shapes that looked almost human, but faded away when he tried to focus on them. The woods pressed in, branches arching over the cab, thickening the darkness, and every now and then, he glimpsed a pale shape, like a face, or the suggestion of eyes, watching from the shadows. He told himself it was just the way the headlights played tricks, but the unease gnawed at him. He tried the CB radio again. "Anyone near Mill Creek? Come back. This is Lone Star. I'm lost. Road's not right. Anybody?" The answer was a high, whistling noise, like breath sucked through teeth, and then another garbled voice, barely a whisper, "Don't leave alone." Sam jerked his hand away, as if the mic had burned him. He checked the side mirror. In the red glow of his tail lights, something moved along the trailer, long shadows, the shapes impossible to make out, but definitely moving. He shifted in his seat, heart hammering, and put his foot on the gas. The road twisted, and for a brief second he thought he saw the end. A break in the trees, a wide open sky, but it closed again, as quickly as it came, swallowed by branches that twisted together, knitting the darkness shut. Every sense screamed that something was terribly wrong. The air in the cab was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but underneath it, something sour, rot, or old wood, or worse. The clock on the dash blinked, stuttered, then rolled back 10 minutes. Sam stared at it, then at his watch. Same time, but both devices now disagreed with each other, both wrong. The GPS voice dropped lower, almost whispering, "Don't stop." Sam hit the brakes anyway, leaning his head against the wheel. He squeezed his eyes shut, tried to count his breaths, tried to picture anything but the endless road, the branches, the sense of something waiting. When he opened his eyes, his headlights shone on the battered mailbox again, now so close, the paint was flaking off in curls. He'd gone in a circle. The trees were inches from his mirrors. The forest had moved, or he had, and the GPS just kept repeating, "Continue straight." Sam's mind was unspooling. He'd passed the same mailbox 3-4 times now. Each loop, the forest pressed in, branches reaching almost to his mirrors, the bark seeming to writhe in his peripheral vision. The feeling that he was being watched had grown into the certainty that he was not alone. The headlights stabbed into the woods, illuminating shapes that didn't belong, slashes of white along the trunks, knotted scars that could have been faces, and eyes, yes, eyes, gleaming wetly before vanishing when he stared straight at them. He was sweating, though the night was cold. He killed the engine again, desperate for a new plan, and silence washed over him, dense as water. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, fighting the urge to cry out. For a moment he thought he heard whispering, so faint it could have been his imagination, or the wind. But there was no wind, not anymore. The branches outside hung perfectly still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. His GPS chirped suddenly, voice now warbled and faint, as if playing from underwater. "In 1 mile, turn left." But there was no turn. There never was. The road outside looked almost erased, gravel dissolving into moss and mud. He had to move. Sitting still felt worse than moving forward, like if he waited too long, something would find him. He started the engine, the lights flickering for a heartbeat before stabilizing. He put the truck in gear, tires spinning slightly in mud that had not been there before. As he crept forward, the dashboard lights faded in and out, the radio turning itself on and off with a mechanical click. For a brief second, the speakers hissed, and Sam heard a child's voice singing a lullaby, a tune his mother used to hum long before she died. It faded to static. He shook his head, gritting his teeth. "Get it together," he muttered, but his own voice sounded strange and distant. The trees pressed closer with every foot. The beams of the headlights showed that some of the trunks were twisted into unnatural shapes, knots resembling gaping mouths, or long,
reaching fingers. A branch scraped along the cab, shrill as nails on glass, and Sam jerked the wheel reflexively, heart pounding.
He looked up and realized the moonlight was gone. The sky above, replaced by a latticework of branches so dense he could barely see the stars. Shadows moved along the edge of the forest, flickering just out of reach, and the fog began to thicken, rolling low across the road, swallowing the shoulders, the ditches, even the roots that crawled toward the pavement. He slammed on the brakes. The truck rocked, and then was still, surrounded by mist. He grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, hand shaking, and rolled down the window, shining the beam into the darkness. The light caught on something, a scrap of cloth, hanging from a branch. He blinked, and it was gone. "No, you're tired. That's all." But the unease refused to lift. Sam decided he couldn't just keep circling. He had to try something different. He punched the GPS, hoping to reset it, but it froze, screen bleeding with lines of digital snow. It began to scroll random numbers and letters, then flashed a single message. He felt something cold slide down his spine. A tap at the passenger window made him jerk around. Nothing but a smear of condensation. He wiped it, breath ragged, and saw reflected in the glass shapes in the trees, tall and thin, moving closer. When he looked directly, they vanished. In the reflection, they stayed. He snapped his head back, his heart hammering in his chest, and mashed the horn, the sound echoing weirdly flat, swallowed by the woods. Sam tried the CB radio again, pleading now. "Anyone please. Stuck on Mill Creek Road. I need help. If anyone can hear." A response came, a chorus of overlapping voices, none human, hissing in a dozen languages, words he couldn't understand. They rose and fell, whispering, "Don't leave the road, don't leave the road." He threw the mic down, his hand trembling. In desperation, he threw the rig into reverse, determined to backtrack the way he'd come, but the mirrors were now just black, nothing reflecting but his own wild eyes and a writhing, shifting background. The moment he tried to move, the truck thud, as if something large had latched onto the back. He felt the cab shudder, branches clawing at the trailer, roof, even the side windows. Sam tried to accelerate, but the wheels spun. In the red glow of the taillights, he saw roots had surfaced from the mud and wrapped around the rear tires, tightening as he watched. His heart jackhammered as he shifted forward and back, desperate to break free. Each attempt only made the forest close in, trunks now so near, he could have reached out and touched them from his window. The GPS was dead now, the display black and cold. The clock on the dash spun forward, then backward, settling on a time that made no sense. Sam stared at his own reflection, and for a moment, it smiled back, a wide wooden grin that was not his own. He recoiled, choking on panic, and looked outside. The trees had almost closed off the road completely. The only way forward was through, and Sam understood, finally, that whatever wanted him out here wasn't done yet. He floored the gas, the engine howling, branches screeching against metal as the forest closed in, the world shrinking to a tunnel of darkness and moving wood. And still, just at the edge of the fog, eyes watched him, waiting for the next mistake. Sam's hands trembled on the wheel, sweat cold against his skin. As the truck inched forward, the engine's growls sounding distant, muffled, as if the forest was swallowing the noise. The cab's windows steamed from his breath, blurring the night into a shifting mess of moving shadow and glinting bark. The headlights, so bright minutes ago, now seemed feeble, devoured by the fog, and the trees leaning in on every side. Every sense told Sam he should stop, but terror kept him moving. The road, if it could still be called a road, was little more than a winding muddy ribbon, hemmed in by roots and trunks that seemed to pulse and shift with every foot he traveled. He blinked hard, trying to force away the dizziness. For a moment,
He saw his mother's face in the glass, lips moving as if to warn him, but when he blinked again, it was only his own haunted reflection staring back. The GPS remained dark, nothing but a blank screen, and the faintest flicker of light, sometimes shaping the word stay, then gone. The radio crackled with bursts of static, snatches of laughter, then sobs, then silence again. He fumbled for his phone, thinking to use it as a flashlight, but it too was dead, no display, no charge, though he'd plugged it in that morning. A scraping sound tore through the cab, a long, drawn-out screech of wood against metal. Sam jerked the wheel, heart hammering, as a thick branch dragged itself along the side of his trailer. He thought he saw it curl and flex, as if searching for a way in. Panic spiked. He pressed the gas harder, tires spitting mud, and for a terrible moment, the whole rig lurched, threatened to tip. He righted it, forcing himself to breathe, gripping the wheel so tightly his hands ached. "Come on," he whispered, voice hoarse. "Just keep moving, just keep." But the road twisted again, forcing him to slow. The world outside had collapsed to a tunnel, the forest walls pressing so close that even the side mirrors couldn't see beyond them. Overhead, the branches knotted together, strangling what little sky remained. The truck's interior was filled with the earthy stink of wet moss, sap, and something older, something like rot. He risked a glance to his right. In the ghostly glare of his headlights, the trees were so close their bark seemed to twitch. He caught glimpses of runes or symbols gouged into the trunks, circles, arrows, jagged marks that pulsed in and out of sight as the lights moved. Some shapes looked almost like faces, eyes wide and empty, mouths open in silent screams. He snapped his gaze back to the road. A sudden bang from the roof made him flinch. Something heavy was moving up there, thudding and scraping along the metal. He ducked lower in his seat, fighting the urge to jump out and run. He forced himself to look straight ahead, trying to ignore the thumps, the scratching at the windows, the sense that if he looked away for even a second, the trees would break through and pull him out.
The truck slowed again, tires bogged down by a tangle of roots, the cab shuddering as if the earth itself was trying to hold him back. He eased his foot on the gas, willing the engine not to stall. "Please," he whispered, "just let me out." Then through the fog, a flicker, a shape standing in the road, no more than a shadow, impossibly tall, arms dangling nearly to the ground, its head cocked as if listening. Sam slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding, nearly jackknifing. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. He stared, breath coming in ragged bursts, heart pounding loud enough to drown out everything else. The shadow didn't advance. It seemed to dissolve with the mist, as if it had never been there. Sam wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, a mind battered by fear and fatigue. But then, behind him, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the muck, slow, dragging, as if something with weight and hunger was coming closer. He fumbled for the door, hand shaking. Outside, the forest looked alive, branches writhing, roots curling, the ground itself shifting underfoot. He slammed the door, locked it, and pressed his forehead to the wheel, whispering prayers he hadn't said in years. The radio snapped on, his father's voice, long dead, whispering his name. "Sammy, don't let them know you're afraid." The headlights flickered, and for a split second, Sam saw the mailbox again, battered, leaning, nearly consumed by the woods. But it was different now. Something was nailed to it, a ragged scrap of paper, flapping in the wind. On it, scrawled in dark, wet strokes, was his own name. He screamed, a raw, animal sound, and slammed his fist against the dashboard. The lights surged brighter for a moment, and in that instant, the trees seemed to flinch, pulling back just a hair. With a surge of desperate hope, Sam floored the gas. The truck tore forward, mud spraying, roots snapping beneath the wheels.
the tunnel of trees splitting for a breath of space as he barreled through. He didn't look back, but in his side mirror, he saw the trees knitting themselves together again, swallowing the road, erasing every trace he'd passed. He pressed on, terrified, knowing that if he slowed even once, the forest would close for good. The cab reeked of earth and fear. All that remained was to keep moving, into the dark, into the unknown, praying for even a sliver of dawn. The road ahead was a twisting, muddy scar through the forest, but Sam barely registered anything except the primal urge to keep moving, to not let the trees touch him, to not let the shadows catch up. The headlights flickered, sputtered, but stayed alive. His knuckles ached. His jaw was clenched so tight, he thought his teeth might shatter. Every turn of the wheels was a fight. The forest seemed to press back, roots clutching at the tires, low limbs dragging across the trailer with a bone-deep scrape. He dared not slow, he barely breathed. The sense of being watched, hunted, gnawed at him from every direction. The cab, once his refuge from the world, felt shrunken and exposed, a glass bubble in a living nightmare. The GPS was dead, black, a cold blank eye on his dash. The radio hissed, then fell silent, then erupted with laughter that was not his own. He turned it off and threw it to the floor. Fog pressed against the windshield so thick he could barely see the hood. Still, he barreled forward, knowing there was nothing left but momentum and fear. A branch crashed against the roof, and he flinched, ducking instinctively, expecting it to punch through. The sound was like claws scraping bone. Sam gritted his teeth and kept driving. Something shifted at the edge of the fog, a tall, thin figure stepping out into the headlights, only to dissolve into shadow as soon as he blinked. Faces flickered among the trunks, stretched and twisted, open-mouthed and hollow-eyed, each vanishing when his gaze tried to hold them. The forest was alive, and it did not want him to leave. Then suddenly, silence. The trees stopped moving. The roots slackened their grip. For a brief instant, Sam could see a gap ahead, a thinning of trunks, a widening of space. He pressed harder on the gas, heart leaping. "Come on, come on, come on," he begged, voice little more than a sob. But just as the road seemed to open, the truck lurched. The cab tilted sharply, one wheel dropping into a pit. Sam slammed the brakes, fought the wheel, heard the horrible grinding snap as a tire spun free in the air. He looked in the mirror, hoping for solid ground, but the lights only showed fog and the thick, heaving shadows of branches closing behind him. He slammed the door and stumbled out, boots sinking into the muck. The forest air hit him like a wall, heavy, damp, sweet with rot. Every breath tasted wrong. He grabbed a flashlight, beam trembling as he shone it at the stuck tire. Roots, thick as wrists, coiled up from the mud and around the axle, pulsing as if they had a heartbeat. He staggered back, cursing, and swung the flashlight wildly at the undergrowth. That's when he saw it. Something hunched just beyond the reach of the light, a shape tall as a man, but all wrong angles and shadows, watching, waiting. Behind it, more shapes, barely visible, rising from the brush, pale and bark-skinned, some with faces, some with hollow holes where eyes should be. Their mouths opened and closed, but no sound came out. They beckoned. Sam's mind snapped. He backed up, falling against the cab. "No, leave me alone." He fumbled with the driver's door, flung himself back inside, locking everything. He panted, eyes wild, as something heavy landed on the roof, the cab shuddering with the weight. He screamed, pounded the horn, praying for any human sound to break the spell. The truck's interior lights flickered, the dashboard coming to life for one last time. The GPS glowed, showing a single word: surrender. Then it went dark again. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting to control his breathing, to will himself awake, because surely, this had to be a nightmare. But the cold sweat, the smell, the hammering in his chest were all too real. The trees pressed close against the cab, the sound of scratching and tapping, softer now, almost gentle, as if caressing. He remembered what his grandfather once said, "If you ever feel the woods watching, never let it know your name. Never answer if it calls." The radio burst to life, a chorus of voices chanting his name, growing louder, twisting it into something ancient and strange. "Samuel, Sam, Sam, Sam," he screamed. "No," and in a last act of defiance, grabbed the GPS and smashed it against the dash. The lights went out.
The night was already half gone when Rick turned his rig onto the detour. The original route home was blocked for construction. A bright orange sign flashing "Road closed. Follow detour." He swore under his breath, glancing at the clock. 2:03 a.m. He was bone-tired, wrists stiff from hours at the wheel, eyes gritty and sore. The world outside was nothing but fog and shadow, an endless wash of grey lit only by his headlights and the occasional reflectors lining the roadside. The radio was down to static and old country, neither of which could keep him awake much longer. He clicked the dial and tried humming along. Every song faded into the same tired refrain, and the loneliness of the highway pressed in. He rolled the window down to let the chill slap him awake. All he wanted was to make it home by dawn, crawl into bed, and forget the last 3 days even happened. The detour route felt unfamiliar, twisting him down county roads and narrow lanes he'd never seen before. The GPS showed a blue line threading through a web of black, rerouting every few miles, as if confused about where he even was. The fog grew thicker, swallowing his headlights, until they barely reached the edge of the pavement. The world outside narrowed to a tunnel of light. Beyond that, nothing but darkness, and the pale ghosts of trees flitting past. Rick's hands tensed on the wheel. He kept blinking, fighting off the heaviness that wanted to drag his eyelids shut. Somewhere up ahead, the gloom pulsed with a flash of red and blue, distant like heat lightning behind a mountain. Rick slowed, squinting, trying to make sense of the colors bleeding through the mist. He rolled up the window and turned off the radio, letting the engine's low rumble fill the silence. The lights grew brighter as he crept forward, resolving into the unmistakable pattern of emergency vehicles, a cruiser, an ambulance, and a fire truck parked haphazardly across both lanes. Instinct made Rick's stomach twist. He'd seen his share of wrecks on the road, late-night rollovers, twisted metal, the occasional deer collision, but there was a stillness to this scene that set his nerves on edge. Even before he reached the flashing cones and the grim-faced deputy waving traffic through, he knew something about this accident was different. He slowed to a crawl, rolling past the cop, who barely glanced at him, too busy talking into a shoulder radio. The air was thick with the copper tang of spilled radiator fluid, and something sharper, something that pricked at Rick's nose and told him blood was near. Through the fog, the shattered remains of a sedan were visible, a colorless heap of glass and crumpled steel, doors wrenched open like a broken jaw. The paramedics were working fast. One held a flashlight over the wreck, while another steadied a stretcher at the driver's side. A third figure moved with practiced urgency, pulling someone free from the twisted car. Rick's headlights caught the scene in a strobe as he rolled slowly past, and for an instant, the fog parted, the world sharpened, and he saw himself. Rick's breath caught. It wasn't a passing resemblance. He saw the same battered leather jacket, the same patched ball cap, the torn sleeve where he'd snagged it 2 weeks ago on a loading dock. The face was his, slack and bloodied, lips parted in a rictus of pain or shock. A bright smear of red marred the cheek, and one eye was swollen shut. He watched frozen as the paramedics heaved his double onto the stretcher, strapping him in, checking his vitals. He wanted to call out, but no sound came. The world seemed to slow,
sound warping, light smearing across his vision. His truck rolled forward, as if of its own accord, and just as quickly as it began, the moment ended. The ambulance doors snapped shut on his own pale face. The cop waved him on, and Rick found himself accelerating, headlights chasing down the empty fog once more. He drove for a mile, before his thoughts caught up to his hands. He jerked the wheel, pulled off onto the gravel shoulder, and sat there, heart hammering, staring into the dark. The crash site had vanished behind him. No more flashing lights, no more figures in the fog. Rick shook his head, squeezed his eyes shut, and forced himself to breathe. He checked the mirrors, nothing but mist, and the feeble glow of his taillights reflected back. He pressed a palm to his chest. It was pounding, but whole. He flexed his fingers, touched his face. No blood, no bruises. He glanced in the mirror, half expecting to see a stranger, but it was just him, tired, older than he remembered, eyes wide with shock. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. The words died in the cab. He reached for his phone, but the screen was dark. Dead battery, or maybe he'd forgotten to charge it at the last truck stop. He shivered, suddenly very awake. He stared down the road, torn between turning back to the crash site, if it even existed, and fleeing as fast as he could. The silence was heavy, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he'd do next. Rick sat in the cab, engine idling, the world pressing in from all sides. For a long moment, he couldn't move. His mind ran in circles, searching for a logical explanation. Stress, exhaustion, a trick of the light and fog. Maybe the paramedics were helping someone who just looked like him, someone with the same jacket, the same hat. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat. The image wouldn't leave him. That face, his face, haunted the edges of his vision every time he blinked. Finally, he eased the truck back onto the road. The world outside felt different now, thinner somehow, like a stage set after the actors had left. The fog swallowed the tail end of his headlights, refusing to let him see more than a dozen yards ahead. He leaned forward, eyes darting from side to side, hunting for signs that the accident scene had ever existed. There was nothing but asphalt, shadows, and the low hum of tires on wet pavement. He turned the radio back on, seeking any distraction, but the music seemed distant, warped, like it was coming from underwater. A DJ's voice cut in, tinny and strange. "For all you drivers on the midnight highway, remember, slow down, stay safe, and watch the road ahead." The song resumed, a haunting steel guitar that made Rick shiver. He checked the rear view again, nothing but the slow swirl of mist.
His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He tried to focus on something normal. He reached up and scratched the patch on his ball cap, fingers lingering on the frayed edge, proof that he was real, solid, here. But the memory of that stretcher, that bloodied face, gnawed at him. He ran his tongue along his teeth, searching for the taste of copper, the sting of an open wound, but found only stale coffee and fear. Then the GPS glitched. The route line flickered, pixelated, then vanished altogether. "Rerouting," the robotic voice said, suddenly too loud in the quiet cab. The map spun in place, showing no streets at all, just a void. Rick jabbed at the screen, but it only stuttered and went black. "Damn thing," he muttered, but unease coiled in his gut. It felt as if the road itself was changing, as if he were driving in circles, back towards something he wasn't meant to escape. He pressed harder on the gas, determined to get away from the nightmare. The road grew more unfamiliar, even though he was sure he hadn't made any turns. The white lines blurred, seeming to snake across the asphalt on their own. A sign flashed by, "Welcome to Lincoln County." He'd seen that sign already, at least twice, since the detour began. But he'd never left Lincoln County, had he? A sudden headache bloomed behind his eyes,
sharp and pulsing. He squinted, wiped sweat from his brow. Fatigue, he told himself, that's all it was, fatigue, or maybe a panic attack. He gripped the wheel tighter and forced himself to keep going. The CB radio crackled to life, making him jump. For a second it was only static, then a voice cut through, "Rick, slow down." The sound was muffled, unplaceable, almost familiar. "Who is this?" Rick demanded, fumbling for the mic. No answer, just static. Then the same DJ voice as before, now faint. "Watch the road, Rick." He shivered, feeling the icy prickle of sweat on his arms. His eyes darted to the mirrors, half expecting to see that twisted wreck, those flashing lights. But the road was empty. He pressed the button again. Breaker 19. Anyone out here? Silence. The loneliness felt complete, oppressive. Suddenly, a flicker at the side of the road. Rick's heart leapt. Was that the same crash site, somehow come around again? He slowed, squinting through the haze, but there was nothing. Just a ditch, half filled with water and weeds, and a battered old road sign bent at a sharp angle. No lights, no ambulance, no cops. Still, he felt eyes on him. He rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the chill. He flicked on the dome light, and checked his reflection in the visor mirror. There he was, tired, a little pale, but unhurt. He forced himself to smile, trying to break the spell. "You're losing it, buddy," he told himself. "You need sleep." But as he looked deeper, a cold certainty washed over him. The memory of his other self, being loaded into the ambulance, was too vivid to be just a dream. The GPS came back to life, buzzing with static, then blinking a new route, one that doubled back, leading straight to the spot where he'd seen the crash. "Turn around," the voice said, flat and robotic. Rick slammed his fist on the dash. "No way, I'm not going back." He drove on, pushing through the fog, but the road only twisted, forcing him back. The white lines curled, herding him toward the place he'd tried to escape. The silence grew heavier, as if something unseen was waiting for him up ahead. His head pounded. Every sign, every shadow, began to look like an omen. The only thing Rick knew for sure was that he couldn't outrun what he'd seen. Not tonight, not on this road. The minutes stretched, twisting into something slippery and uncertain. Rick's hands were numb on the wheel. As he pressed on, the road narrowing and blurring under the attack of the fog. The GPS kept trying to reroute, every robotic command looping him back toward the crash site. Even the radio was no comfort. The DJ's voice came and went in fragments, every other word warped and haunted. Each time Rick passed a sign, it was a little less familiar, a little more warped by mist and shadow. Determined not to let his fear rule him, Rick made a decision. He would go back, see the site in the clear, and prove to himself that it was just a trick of his tired brain. He slowed, craned his neck to find a safe place to turn, and then eased the rig into a slow, cautious U-turn. The truck's headlights arced over the roadside ditch, and for a moment, the fog parted, just enough to show deep ruts, tire tracks, a dark stain in the grass. He shivered, forcing himself not to look too closely. He turned back the way he'd come, the detour road twisting ahead, empty, except for the low sweep of fog hugging the ground. The world was silent, except for the thrum of his engine, and the hiss of his own breath. It didn't take long, before the flashing lights reappeared in the mist, almost as if they'd been waiting for him. He slowed again, dread blooming in his chest, the sick certainty that what he was about to see was no accident at all. The scene was exactly as before: ambulance, cruiser, fire trucks scattered across the pavement, their lights flickering as if underwater. Rick braked and pulled off the road, heart pounding. He switched on his hazard lights, letting their orange blink join the silent waltz of reds and blues up ahead. He climbed down from the cab, boots crunching on the damp gravel. The fog seemed thicker on foot, swirling around his knees, swallowing the beams of his flashlight. He approached the wreck, feeling as if he moved through water. The mangled car was there, even more twisted up close, the doors torn away, and the hood crushed almost flat. Broken glass glittered in the mud, tiny splinters of a life interrupted. He wanted to call out, "Hello, anyone need help?" But his voice stuck in his throat. The paramedics were there again, backs bent over the stretcher. Their faces were blurred, more like smears of color and shadow than real people.
He stepped closer, the world growing silent, except for the low mutter of the paramedics. As they lifted the body from the car, Rick saw the truth. It was himself again, same jacket, same hat, same weary face, now slack and deathly pale. This time he saw the details he'd missed. The old scar under his chin, the silver chain around his neck, the battered wallet poking from his back pocket. All his. Rick staggered forward, hands trembling. He was right there, watching as the paramedics strapped his double onto the stretcher, whispering words he couldn't quite catch. A cold panic threatened to split his mind. He wanted to run, to scream, but couldn't move. The air pressed against him, thick as syrup. Suddenly, the eyes of his other self flickered open. For a heartbeat, Rick met his own gaze, utterly lucid, impossibly aware. The double's lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a wave of terror crashed through Rick, stronger than anything he'd ever felt. He staggered back, gasping, fighting the urge to bolt for the safety of his truck. The onlookers began to murmur, voices rising and falling like a distant tide. Rick strained to hear, but the words were garbled, foreign, almost backwards. The world felt unstable, flickering at the edges, the fog rolling in and out, in long cold breaths. As the paramedics lifted his body into the ambulance, the doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the misty road. The crowd faded, faces drifting apart like leaves in water, until Rick stood alone, shivering and helpless in the deepening gloom. He turned and ran for his truck, boots splashing through unseen puddles. He climbed into the cab, slamming the door, chest heaving. He tried to start the engine, but the dashboard was dead. No lights, no comforting whine of ignition, just silence. Rick grabbed his phone. The screen was black, cold to the touch. He tried the radio, the CB, but every device was lifeless. It was as if the world itself had decided to let him slip away, to float in this between place, with no sound and no rescue. He looked up at the windshield, and for a moment, his own reflection stared back, bloodied and dazed, trapped on the other side of the glass. The road ahead seemed to stretch forever, empty except for the swirl of mist and the fading echo of distant sirens. Rick slumped over the wheel, his breath fogging the windshield, in short, frantic bursts. For a few moments, all he could do was listen to the too loud thud of his own heart. The fog pressed tight around the cab, so dense now it seemed to seep through the cracks in the doors and windows. The world outside was more dream than memory, a colorless landscape, where even the trees looked like charcoal smudges, and the road beneath his tires felt like it could vanish at any second. He forced himself upright, wiping sweat and fog from his brow. "Get a grip," he muttered. "It's just a nightmare, that's all." But every inch of his body rebelled against the thought. He'd seen himself loaded into that ambulance. He'd felt the terror in those eyes. He could still taste the copper tang of blood, even though his tongue found nothing but dry fear. He tried the ignition again. Nothing. The dash stayed dark, and the key felt loose and useless in his shaking hand. Even the headlights had gone out, leaving him with nothing but the faint orange blink of his hazard lights, throbbing in the mist like a dying heart. Time slipped sideways. The air inside the cab grew heavy, harder to breathe. Rick fumbled for the door handle and staggered out, boots squelching into a patch of mud. The ground was sticky, sucking at his soles, as if the earth itself wanted to claim him. He looked up and down the road. No traffic, no headlights, just the endless roll of fog, drifting and swirling
like breath from some unseen giant. He tried his phone, hoping for a bar of service, a sign from the living world. The screen flickered and flashed, showing only random lines of static, then died again. He turned it over in his hand, suddenly unsure if it had ever really worked at all. The CB radio, inside the cab, was equally silent, not even the comfort of static. His gaze drifted down the road, pulled again toward the place where the ambulance had stood. He started walking, slow at first, then faster, desperate for anything real. His boots splashed through shallow puddles, the cold soaking through his socks, each step harder than the last. As he moved, the landscape started to change, repeating itself in a way that made his skin crawl. The same battered guardrail, the same torn mile marker, the same tangle of broken branches, over and over again, as if he were walking a loop he couldn't escape. At one point, he saw his own footprints in the mud, side by side with fresh tire tracks, the exact pattern of his own rigs. Panic simmered beneath the surface, but something else was pulling him on. He wasn't sure if he was chasing an answer, or running from a question he didn't want to ask. The fog thinned, just a little, and he caught a glint of red tie lights, glowing dimly in the mist. Hope flickered. Maybe the ambulance hadn't gone far. He hurried closer, only to realize that what he'd seen was just the dying reflection of his own hazard lights, bouncing between the fog and a slick patch of black top. No rescue, no sign of life. But as he stood there, a familiar sound rose in the air, the distant wail of a siren, impossibly faint, as if heard through water, or from another world. The sound sent chills crawling down his spine. He tried shouting, "Hey, can you hear me? I need help." But his own voice sounded muffled, like it was being swallowed by the fog. The siren faded. Rick spun around, searching for any break in the clouds, any landmark. He started running, boots slapping on the wet road, lungs burning with every breath. He stopped only when the crash site came into view again. Impossible, but there it was, just as before. The car, the ambulance, the onlookers. But this time, something was different. The paramedics were standing still, heads bowed, their bodies blurred, as if caught between one moment and the next. The crowd was silent, frozen, their faces turned away from him.
Drawn forward, Rick stepped across the line of broken glass, past the ambulance, and stopped beside the car. He peered in and saw himself slumped behind the wheel, blood trickling from his brow, lips parted, as if whispering a secret. A strange calm settled over Rick, an understanding that he was looking at himself from somewhere outside, stuck between the living and the lost. He reached out, hand trembling, and touched the glass. It was cold, slick with dew, but gave a little under his palm. He pressed harder, desperate to feel anything real. For a heartbeat, the two versions of himself seemed to merge, the inside and the outside, the living and the dying. He felt the jolt of impact, the bright flash of headlights, the crunch of metal and bone. Memory and nightmare blended. Then it was gone. The sirens faded. The scene vanished. He was alone again, standing in the middle of the empty road, heart pounding, breath sharp. He turned in a circle, searching for the truck, the ambulance, the world he'd known. But all that remained was the fog, thick and endless, swallowing every trace of his passage. Rick realized he couldn't remember if he was alive, or if he was simply a ghost, doomed to replay the moment of his death, until he learned what the universe wanted him to know. Rick stood in the fog, the world around him suspended between memory and dream. A stretch of highway unmoored from time. The quiet pressed in, so total he could hear his own heartbeat echo in his ears. The pain in his chest was dull now, far away, replaced by a strange weightlessness, as if he were both standing on the cold asphalt and floating a foot above it. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to wake up, to feel the thrum of his truck beneath him, to smell diesel
and coffee, and know the world was real. But when he opened them, he was still alone. Just the endless, silent road, and that ever-present mist. A flicker of red and blue cut the gloom ahead, wavering and then stabilizing. The crash site had returned, exactly as before. Ambulance, fire truck, the crowd, all frozen mid-motion, colors bleeding at the edges. This time, Rick felt neither fear nor dread, only a weary resignation. He knew now there was no running from this, no shortcut to daylight. He was caught in a loop, forced to watch his own ending over and over, until he could face it without looking away. He walked toward the scene, every step slow and deliberate, boots barely making a sound. As he drew closer, the voices of the onlookers began to seep through the fog, a murmur at first, then words, as if the radio dial had finally found the right frequency. Always a matter of time. Never saw it coming. Just let go. The phrases drifted through Rick, chilling but not cruel. The paramedics were gathered around the stretcher again, and on it, himself, pale and battered, eyes closed as if in sleep. The ambulance doors stood open, and for the first time, one of the paramedics turned, meeting Rick's gaze. Her face was clear now, no longer blurred. She looked impossibly familiar, like the memory of someone from childhood, a face he'd trusted, a voice from safer years. She lifted her hand and beckoned. Rick moved closer, his own double's face growing sharper, details aligning with the ones he knew. The old scar, the bitten lip. The watch stopped at 2 or 3. The crowd of onlookers parted without sound as he passed, their faces solemn, almost kind. Some were strangers, others people he hadn't seen since childhood. His father's face, a friend lost to cancer, even a girl he'd loved and let slip away. He stood beside the stretcher, staring down at his own still form. The paramedic reached for his hand, and as their fingers touched, a jolt of memory ripped through him. The screech of brakes, the glare of headlights, the shuddering impact, his own voice shouting, then silence. It came not as a single moment, but as a cascade of every risk he'd ever taken, every hour on the road when he'd told himself he'd be fine, just a little farther, just a little more. He felt the ache of regret, sharp and piercing, words left unsaid, time wasted on things that didn't matter. But beneath it all, something softer, relief, even gratitude. He'd lived, he realized, in all the ways that counted. He'd laughed, fought, loved, lost, and now, maybe, it was time to let go. The scene blurred. The paramedic leaned down, her voice gentle in his ear. "It's all right, Rick. You don't have to be afraid." He wanted to argue, to beg for another chance, but he found he couldn't. Instead he looked up, and for the first time, the fog seemed to thin. The lights of the ambulance glowed warm, instead of cold, and the sirens faded to a peaceful hush. The world split. Ahead the road divided, one path into shadow, the other into a widening glow. The crowd stepped back, making way. Rick felt himself pulled forward by something he couldn't name, his feet light, his heart slowing to a calm, steady beat. As he neared the light, he heard a voice, his own, younger and surer. "You did good, Rick. You made it." The words rang true, a gift, an absolution. He stepped into the brightness, the crash scene falling away behind him. There was no pain, no regret now, only the sense of going home, wherever home really was. And somewhere far away, in another world, a heart monitor beeped. In a hospital room scented with antiseptic and hope, Rick's body stirred. A nurse glanced up, saw movement beneath closed eyelids. She smiled. The world spun on. But in the fog-shrouded world of the in-between, the highway was empty now. The lights gone, the ambulance vanished. Only the hush of mist and the glimmer of dawn on the horizon. Rick's journey was over, and the road was finally clear.
Night had fallen heavy, shrouding the old county highway in a damp, persistent fog that seemed to swallow the world outside the truck's cab. Hank was half an hour behind schedule, knuckles tight on the wheel, the radio crooning low as he searched for the comfort of headlights or even a reflective sign, anything to convince him he wasn't the last soul on this stretch of forgotten road. The world shrank to the circle of his high beams and the steady slap of rain against the windshield. Even the CB was silent. No chatter, no warnings, not a whisper from another rig in miles. As he rounded a bend near the tree line, something pale flashed in the corner of his vision. Hank's foot eased onto the brake. Not quite a stop, just enough for caution. There, on the shoulder, illuminated in a brief flicker of lightning, stood a woman. Her dress, white, full-skirted, the kind that belonged to another decade, gleamed wetly in the glow. Her veil clung to her face and shoulders, rain-soaked and trailing, and a battered bouquet hung limply in her hand. For a heartbeat, Hank just stared, the kind of stunned where your brain refuses to catch up to your eyes. Who the hell would be out here, dressed for a wedding, at this hour, and in this weather? The wipers thudded, clearing the foggy glass, and the woman lifted one trembling hand. Her gesture was slow, oddly formal, like she was waiting for a carriage, not a mud-spattered Peterbilt. Hank rolled to a stop, hesitating. He glanced at his phone. No signal, just as expected. His gut told him to keep driving, but the memory of his own daughter, alone and far from home, made him shift the truck into park and roll down the window. "Ma'am, you all right?" His voice sounded strange, bouncing back off the trees and the fog. The woman stepped closer, the train of her dress gathering mud. Her face was pale, lips almost blue from cold, eyes fixed on him, huge, dark, and shining with tears. "Could you give me a ride?" Her voice was soft, but clear, the words strange on the wet air. "I need to get to Willow Creek, please. He's waiting for me." Something in her tone was urgent, desperate yet polite. Hank's doubts warred with his better nature, but in the end, he reached over, popped the passenger door. "All right, climb in. Let's get you somewhere warm." She nodded, gliding rather than walking to the step. Her dress swept up behind her as she climbed in, leaving a trail of wet leaves and grit. The inside of the cab instantly felt colder, as if the fog had followed her in. She sat primly, bouquet in her lap, her hands trembling, but her back ramrod straight. Hank cleared his throat, fighting awkwardness as he got the truck rolling again. "What happened? You get stranded at a wedding out here?" He tried to sound casual, but the question came out rough, too curious. She didn't meet his eyes. "No one was supposed to leave, but I had to. I promised I'd come." She shivered, staring straight ahead. "Can you take me to the Willow Creek Bridge? That's where I'm meant to be." He glanced at her, brow furrowed. The dress was beautiful but old-fashioned, lace fraying at the sleeves, hem muddy and torn. The bouquet looked real, but the flowers were bruised and limp, petals the color of old paper. Her shoes, white, delicate, were splattered with grit, one strap broken. She seemed impossibly out of place. "Willow Creek's not far," Hank said, masking the chill in his voice. "But there's not much out there, just the old bridge and woods." She nodded, silent. The rain thickened, drumming on the roof. Hank reached for the heater, turning it up, but the air stayed stubbornly cold. He rubbed his arms, stealing glances at the woman. Every time the headlights caught her, she seemed half made of mist, fading in and out of shadow. Somebody expecting you?" He tried again. "Want me to call anyone once we get a signal?" The bride turned to him, eyes glistening. "He's waiting. I have to keep my promise. I made a vow." The answer was too direct,
almost rehearsed. Hank pressed his lips together, focusing on the road. Willow Creek Bridge was a good 10 miles ahead, through winding curves and a stand of old sycamores. He tried to shake off the creeping unease. Maybe she'd been left at the altar, snapped, or run from a bad scene. He'd heard stranger stories. The road, already slick, seemed to narrow under his tires. The trees leaned in, branches dripping, and the fog thickened, curling in ghostly ribbons across the glass. Silence settled in the cab, heavy and brittle. The only sounds were the wipers and her slow, shaky breaths. Hank's hands tightened on the wheel. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her bouquet quiver, petals dropping one by one to the rubber mat. He resisted the urge to ask anything more. A mile from the bridge, the temperature plunged, the windshield frosted at the edges, and Hank's breath puffed white in the air. The woman shifted, hands clenching around her bouquet. "Almost there," she whispered, voice so thin he barely caught it. Her gaze was locked on the darkness ahead, eyes wide and bright as the truck rolled toward the bridge, and the unknown waiting on the other side. The cab felt colder with every mile. Hank rubbed his palms together, but the heater's blowers might as well have been pumping air from a grave. The woman in the wedding dress sat utterly still, bouquet clenched tight in her lap, staring forward, as if any glance to the side might shatter the fragile silence hanging between them. He tried again for small talk, his voice rough. "You from around here? Willow Creek's a long way out for a wedding, isn't it?" He didn't look at her directly, keeping his eyes on the shimmer of wet road and the skeletal branches arching overhead. She hesitated, her lips parting, but the words came out softly, fading into the hum of the engine. "I lived here once, a long time ago. I waited too long then. I can't be late again." The way she said it made Hank's skin crawl. There was something hollow in her tone, a sorrow that seeped into the air. He glanced at her hands. Her knuckles were white, nails pressed into the stems of the wilted flowers. Water from her dress dripped to the rubber floor mats, gathering in a small puddle that crept toward his boots. Hank flipped the radio on, hoping for music, but only static blared from the speakers. He spun the dial, searching for anything: country, news, preacher's warnings, but each station was swallowed by the hiss of empty air. The static pulsed in time with his heart, and for a moment, between the noise, he thought he heard a faint melody, a bridal march, off-key and far away. He switched the radio off, shivering. "You got someone to meet at the bridge, family waiting." He forced a chuckle, a feeble attempt to pierce the tension. "Hope they brought a coat, not fit for a dog out tonight." The woman's lips curled, almost a smile, but not quite. "I have to find him. I promised I'd come back, no matter what." She stared out the window, her veil trailing over her shoulder, almost luminous in the passing light from the dashboard. "I wish he knew I tried. I really did." A chill slid down Hank's spine. He focused on the shapes outside. Fog twisted between the trees, each trunk a silent witness. His headlights flashed across a faded sign: "Willow Creek, 3 miles." He felt relief, mixed with dread, creeping up the back of his neck. He risked another glance at the passenger seat. Her reflection shimmered in the side mirror, faint, wavering, almost not there at all. He blinked hard, thinking it was the rain, the fog, his own tiredness. When he looked back, her seatbelt had come undone. He was sure he'd watched her buckle it earlier. Her hands gripped the bouquet so hard, now that petals scattered, falling in slow motion to the mat. The bouquet looked older, more battered, as if it had weathered years, instead of just miles. The cab's windows fogged and frosted. Hank wiped at the glass, but the cold wouldn't leave. The dashboard clock blinked midnight, then glitched, flickering between numbers. The GPS,
recalculated their arrival, but the digital road twisted endlessly, an Ouroboros, eating its own tail. They reached the start of the bridge. The sycamores, on either side, stretched their limbs overhead, forming an archway of blackened wood. The headlights barely pierced the mist. The woman's breathing grew shallower, every inhale sounding like a sob trapped in her chest. Hank slowed to a crawl, the tires crunching over planks, slick with rain and moss. "We're almost there, miss," he said, voice gentle now, almost pleading. "You want me to wait with you? Or, look, if you're in trouble, we can go to the police station. I can help." She shook her head. Tears gleamed on her cheeks, though she never moved to wipe them away. "He'll come. I know he will. I just have to wait here, like before." Her gaze was distant, focused somewhere beyond the fog. "You're very kind. Thank you for the ride." Hank's heart squeezed. He pulled the truck to a stop at the midpoint of the bridge, flicking on the hazards. He reached for his phone, thinking he might at least call someone, anyone. No service, only the spinning icon of a failed connection. When he looked back at the seat, his blood turned to ice. The woman was gone. The dress, the veil, the bouquet, nothing left but a damp imprint on the passenger seat, an impossible chill swirling in the air. Hank stared in disbelief, his mouth working silently. The door hadn't opened. He'd heard nothing, no footsteps, no movement, just silence. He jumped out, flashlight in hand, boots clanging on the wet wood. "Miss," he called, voice cracking. "You there?" The night gave no answer, but the echo of his own panic. He searched the bridge, the roadside, peered into the fog, but there was only darkness. Nothing but the sound of the river rushing below, and the creak of old timbers. A single white flower rested on the passenger seat. When he climbed back in, it glowed faintly in the gloom, petals unspoiled by rain or time. Hank sat there, shivering, the weight of the story settling on his shoulders. He did not know who she was, or who she'd been searching for, but he knew that some promises could not be broken, not even by death or time. Hank drove into Willow Creek, on autopilot, mind whirling, knuckles white against the wheel. He barely registered the streets, each one deserted, slick with rain, lit by the sickly orange of old sodium lamps. The small town had always seemed quaint when he passed through in daylight, but now every storefront looked shuttered and strange, every alley a hollow throat of darkness. The empty passenger seat gnawed at him. The white flower lay on the vinyl, impossibly pristine, a ghostly keepsake that seemed to drain the warmth from the cab. He needed answers. He needed something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. He parked near the only building still open at this hour, a gas station with a flickering neon sign. The cess half burned out, so it read, "Gasation." Hank stumbled inside, bells jingling overhead, bringing the sharp scent of rain and diesel with him. The night clerk looked up from behind the counter, startled. "Can I help you, sir?" Hank's voice was raw, nearly hoarse. "You ever seen a woman out on the highway? White dress, wedding veil, maybe carrying flowers?" The clerk blinked. "Tonight, yeah. She asked for a ride." Hank hesitated, struggling for the right words, and then she wasn't there anymore. Just vanished. Left this. He fished the flower from his pocket, laying it on the counter. The clerk's face went pale. He glanced over Hank's shoulder, as if expecting the bride to materialize behind him. A silence stretched until a man sipping coffee in the corner, a local, judging by his muddy boots and reflective vest, spoke up. "You pick up the Willow Creek bride?" Hank turned. "What?" The man nodded, lowering his mug. "You ain't the first. Sometimes truckers see her, sometimes it's teenagers, or tourists, out on the old bridge, always on nights like this." He pushed back his cap. "My uncle said he saw her once, back when I was a kid. Never forgot it." The clerk cleared his throat, voice lower now,
almost respectful. Story goes back to the 50s. She was supposed to marry a local boy, but he crashed his car on the way to the church. She waited for hours, never got the news. By the time they found him, she'd gone out searching, and folks say she drowned, or maybe just wandered off and froze. He shrugged, eyes fixed on the flower. No one knows for sure.
Hank tried to process it. Hands trembling, she asked me to take her to the bridge. Said someone was waiting. The older man nodded. She's always searching for her groom. People say she appears to those with a good heart. People willing to help. Never makes it past the bridge though. Always vanishes. A cold realization dawned. The air in the station felt colder now, as if the chill from the cab had followed him inside. So what do I do? She just left. Should I call the sheriff? The clerk shook his head quickly. Wouldn't do no good. They know about her, but no one can ever catch her. Just let it be, I guess. Some folks leave a flower on the bridge if they see her, sort of a way to say they cared. The man in the vest added, "Don't blame yourself, trucker. If you helped her, you did more than most." Hank nodded numbly. "Yeah, I tried." He picked up the flower, the petals impossibly soft, and tucked it in his coat. "Guess I'll head back. Thanks for listening." He left the station, boots squelching in puddles, and climbed back into his rig. The wind had picked up, rattling the cab, sending leaves and scraps of newspaper skittering across the empty lot. He sat for a long moment, hands on the wheel, staring at the passenger seat, where the woman had sat. The seat was dry now, the imprint of her dress fading, but he could still feel the echo of her presence, a sense that the story wasn't quite finished. He started the engine, headlights sweeping across rain-slicked asphalt. The GPS flickered, briefly displaying Willow Creek Bridge, before the signal stuttered and died. Hank didn't need directions. He knew he had to go back. One last time. As he pulled away, he caught a glimpse in his side mirror. A pale figure, standing under a street lamp, veil blowing in the wind. He blinked and she was gone. Just shadows and rain. But his heart thudded in his chest, heavy with things left undone. The road back to the bridge was emptier than before, the fog returning to coil around the trees. Hank drove slow, windows cracked despite the cold, half expecting to hear her voice again. A soft request from the darkness. He crossed the bridge, headlights gliding over slick boards and puddles. Halfway across, he pulled over, engine idling, and stepped out with the white flower in his fist. He walked to the railing and placed the bloom between two slats of old wood, letting the river's mist chill his skin. For a moment, the wind stilled. Hank thought he heard a whisper, a thank you, maybe, or the brush of lace on wood. Then the river below rushed louder, and the moment passed. He climbed back into his truck and watched the bridge in his rear view, hoping she'd finally found her way home, or at least someone who would remember her story. Hank lingered at the edge of the bridge, engine rumbling, hands resting on the steering wheel, as if afraid to let go. The fog clung to the railings and hung above the water like breath on cold glass. His headlights painted long pale stripes down the boards, illuminating the flower he'd left wedged in the wood. He half expected her to materialize again, gliding out of the mist in that sodden, beautiful dress, bouquet in hand, eyes searching. But the bridge remained empty. Just him, the wind, and the muted roar of the river below. He sat there, wrestling with disbelief, and a hollow, growing ache he couldn't shake. Everything about the encounter pressed on his mind, each detail refusing to fade. He replayed the way she'd looked at him, the sorrow, the urgency, the sense of some ancient longing that nothing could satisfy. The cab, though empty, still felt impossibly cold.
A ghostly chill radiated from the seat where she had sat, numbing his leg even through thick denim. The radio, silent since the bridge, flickered on of its own accord. For a moment, only static filled the cab. Then beneath the white noise, a soft voice hummed a familiar melody. Here comes the bride, but slow and mournful, like a lullaby for the lost. Hank reached out, hesitated, and finally switched the radio off. The hush that followed was heavier than before. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted, wondering if any of this was real, or just the product of too many lonely miles, and too little sleep. But the evidence, the white flower, the lingering cold, the ache in his chest, reminded him that some things couldn't be explained away. Some things just were. After a while, he started the truck again, intending to drive on, to put distance between himself and whatever he'd witnessed. But as he rolled off the bridge, his headlights stuttered and dimmed, then flared bright as a searchlight, illuminating something caught on the far railing. He braked, heart skipping, and squinted through the windshield. A length of white lace, her veil, fluttered on the breeze, snagged in the rusted metal. Hank's breath caught. He climbed out, boots thumping on the boards, and approached, pulse thrumming with dread and curiosity. The lace was delicate, old-fashioned, still damp from rain or river. It looked impossibly fragile, yet clung stubbornly to the railing, as if waiting for someone to notice. Gently, Hank untangled the fabric, hands shaking. He turned it over, half expecting it to vanish at his touch, but it remained stubbornly real. He held it up, watching droplets of water trace down the filigree, before he folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat. It felt wrong to leave it behind, as if abandoning a piece of the story itself. He looked out over the water, scanning the riverbanks and the misty trees, searching for any movement, a flicker of white, a shifting shadow, a glimpse of her lost form. But the night was empty, except for the swirling fog. A sudden gust of wind made the bridge shudder, and for a moment, Hank heard a faint whisper, almost too soft to be real. "Thank you." He stood, listening, heart hammering. The voice faded into the night, leaving only the river's song. Hank pressed the veil to his chest, suddenly and irrationally comforted. He returned to the cab, cranked the engine, and sat for a minute, the veil in his lap, the white flower resting on the dash.
As he pulled away, the truck's dashboard flickered, the radio coming alive with one last snatch of static and a fragment of a voice. "I have to keep my promise." Then nothing. The GPS reset itself, the map spinning before landing squarely on his next destination, as if the night's detour had never happened. But the clock on the dash blinked 12:01, as if stuck between one day and the next. Hank drove in silence, the road unraveling before him. He glanced in the rearview mirror every few miles, half expecting to see her standing at the edge of the bridge or drifting along the shoulder, veil trailing, bouquet in hand. Once or twice, a shape flickered in the mist, but it always dissolved as he drew closer. To sunrise, he pulled into a rest area and sat for a long time, watching the morning light touch the river far below, burn away the last of the fog. He ran a thumb along the edge of the veil, and the petals of the flower, mind heavy with questions he'd never be able to ask, and answers he might not want to know. He wondered who else had seen her, how many others had carried her sorrow a little farther down the road, then left it behind, changed forever by a passenger who needed to go home, but never quite could. The days and weeks that followed were different for Hank. He drove his routes with the same steady hands, delivered his loads, swapped highway stories at diners, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. No matter how many miles he put behind Willow Creek Bridge, he could never quite escape the chill that haunted his memory,
or the sense that the world was layered with mysteries he'd only just glimpsed. On certain rainy nights, when the fog pulled thick along the tree line and headlights caught the mist just right, he'd feel the cab grow colder. He'd glance at the passenger seat, always empty, but for a fleeting second, he might imagine a shimmer of white, the shape of a dress or a scrap of lace drifting in the corner of his eye. His hands would tighten on the wheel, and he'd find himself whispering, "Not tonight," as if trying to convince the night itself. He kept the white flower and the delicate veil tucked safely in his glove box, wrapped in a handkerchief. Sometimes he'd take them out and run his fingers along the soft petals or the intricate threads, grounding himself with their strange reality. He never told anyone the full story. How could he? He only ever mentioned, in the vaguest of ways, that some stretches of road were best traveled with respect for those who never made it home. But the legend grew. A few weeks later, at a truck stop cafe, Hank overheard a pair of young drivers trading stories. "They say there's a ghost bride out near Willow Creek," one said, voice hushed over his steaming mug. "My cousin saw her. She just stands by the side of the road, staring at every car." The other rolled his eyes, but Hank knew the weight of the tale. He sipped his coffee in silence, wondering how many others had carried her sorrow, even if only for a mile. There were other oddities. His truck's electronics never quite worked the same. The radio sometimes cut out at the same stretch of highway, hissing static or humming a half-remembered wedding tune. Once, his GPS sent him back toward Willow Creek when he was headed in the opposite direction. The dashboard clock flickered at midnight on foggy nights, stubbornly stuck at 12:01 before finally moving forward as he crossed the bridge. The story stayed with him, coloring everything. When he passed through Willow Creek again, he slowed, hands sweating despite the cold. On a whim, he stopped at the bridge and walked its length in the gray dawn. No one else was there. The river ran full and cold beneath. The boards creaked under his boots. He left the flower and veil, wrapped together, wedged into the same gap in the railing where he'd found the lace that rainy night. He stood for a long moment, eyes closed, letting the river's song and the sighing wind wash over him. As he turned to go, the sun crested the trees, catching on the water and throwing a band of gold across the bridge. In that light, for just a heartbeat, he thought he saw a woman standing on the far side, veil billowing, dress shining, bouquet clutched tight. She lifted her hand in a gesture of gratitude, her eyes sad but at peace. Then the light shifted, and she was gone. Back in his cab, Hank felt something unspool inside him, a knot of sorrow that had lingered since that strange night. He realized he wasn't afraid, not really. He was changed. The world felt deeper, richer, laced with grief and love and promises that outlasted lifetimes. He drove away lighter, but always, when the weather turned and the night stretched long, he kept watch for the Willow Creek bride. Over time, other drivers began to leave flowers at the bridge, or pause on their night runs, watching for a glimpse of white in the mist. Some claimed to have seen her, some scoffed, but all treated the stretch of road with a new kind of reverence. The legend spread, a whispered caution and a tribute, all at once. And Hank, he grew older, his hair going gray, his routes shifting from cross-country hauls to shorter, quieter deliveries. But he never forgot. Every year, on the anniversary of that ride, he returned to Willow Creek Bridge with a fresh white flower and a prayer for all those still searching for their way home. Sometimes, as he drove away, he'd glance in the mirror and almost catch a pale figure walking beside the river, keeping her promise. It was enough. The story was part of him now, a reminder that kindness is never wasted, and some vows echo longer than a lifetime.
The sky was a bruise, swollen and dark above the highway, as Cole guided his rig through the endless miles of wet, glistening asphalt. The storm had let up, but only just. A fine, needling drizzle still swept sideways across the windshield, and wind battered at the mirrors like invisible fists. Cole kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gear shift, eyes fixed on the hypnotic rhythm of passing lane lines. His trailer was loaded with fresh-cut pine beams, a solid but ordinary cargo, checked and stamped at the mill before he'd pulled out. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. It was the kind of run he'd made 100 times. Night haul, rural roads, a 3-state journey with no mountain grades, and hardly a town worth slowing for. The dispatcher had double-checked the paperwork. The weight ticket matched the manifest, 34,000, give or take. The weighmaster had slapped the side of the trailer with his clipboard and waved Cole on with a grunt and a smirk. Just another job, just another Thursday. But even as the wipers swept back and forth, Cole noticed something, a subtle drag on the throttle, a heaviness in the way the rig pulled itself along the rain-slicked road. He chalked it up to the weather, to the wind howling across the fields. His Peterbilt was old, a loyal beast, but prone to moods when the air got wet. He nudged the throttle, feeling the engine's pulse through his boots, and settled back into the seat, tuning the radio to a classic rock station, crackling through the storm. The hours passed in a blur of yellow lines and static. The CB radio was dead tonight, not a single check-in from the regulars. Even Big Johnny, who never shut up about roadkill and tail lights, was silent. Cole hummed along to Born to Be Wild as the lights of a small town flickered by. The weight of the day pressed into his shoulders, but the trailer's rhythm behind him was steady, reassuring, at least at first. A few miles past midnight, he hit the first weigh station. Rain pulled on the scale, glittering under the harsh white lamps. Cole rolled his window down, shivering, as the cold air slapped him in the face. He eased the rig onto the scale, brakes hissing. The digital readout glowed green, then yellow, settling on a number a little higher than he remembered from the mill. Still within legal limit, but closer than it should have been. He frowned, checking the paperwork again, but everything was in order. The weighmaster barely glanced up from his newspaper, waving him through without comment. Cole shrugged. Maybe the load had settled, or the scale was off a few £100. It happened. He pulled away, merging back onto the highway, watching the lights of the weigh station recede in the mirror. But as the night deepened, the sense of drag grew worse. The engine labored on the hills, the steering felt sluggish, and the wind, though still blowing, no longer seemed to explain the weight that tugged at the trailer. Cole's mind wandered to bad tires, shifting cargo, even the possibility of a flat he'd missed. He tried to shake the feeling. "Don't get spooked," he muttered, taking a long swig of coffee from his thermos. "You've run worse." Near 2 a.m., with the storm fading to a mist, he spotted the glow of a roadside diner, the kind with a single neon sign, flickering and hopeful in the gloom. Cole pulled in, the truck's headlights washing over the parking lot's puddles, and found a spot near the window. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. The trailer, barely visible behind him in the darkness, seemed to hunker lower than he remembered, as if the springs had sunk deeper into the black top. Inside, the diner was mostly empty. Cole ordered bad coffee and eggs, barely tasting either. The waitress, a tired woman, with heavy eyelids and a nervous smile, asked if he was hauling anything special. "Just lumber," Cole replied, "same as last week." But her gaze lingered on him, as if she knew something he didn't. Back in the parking lot, he circled the trailer, flashlight beam slicing through the mist. The doors were locked tight, no straps loose, no signs of tampering or shifting weight. The pine logs looked the same as before, bound, heavy, silent. Still, he felt the trailer's presence behind him, a density in the air that had nothing to do with wood or rain. Cole climbed back into the cab,
a shiver running through him as he checked the dashboard clock. Almost 3. He rolled out, tires sucking at the wet pavement, and as he merged back onto the highway, he tried to ignore the creeping suspicion that the load had grown heavier while he was inside. The engine strained against the drag, the steering tighter now, every mile feeling a little longer than the last. Far ahead, another way station's lights glimmered through the mist, waiting for him in the darkness. Cole watched the glowing approach of the next way station, like a man anticipating a verdict. The rain had faded to a humid haze, and the sky hung lower than ever, pressing the road into a ribbon of dim reflection. He flexed his shoulders, trying to shake off the sense that his whole rig was dragging an anchor, a weight no fresh-cut pine could explain. He rolled down the window, letting in the dense night air as he slowed into the bright white of the scale house. The sign flashed green, then yellow, then held steady on red. Cole's stomach tightened. The digital readout blinked numbers that couldn't be right, more than 1,000 pounds over the manifest, and almost 500 pounds heavier than his last weigh-in, less than 2 hours before. He pulled to the side as instructed, heart thumping. A board attendant strolled out, clipboard in hand, and made a show of circling the rig with a flashlight. "Got extra cargo tonight, driver?" Cole shook his head, fighting the urge to sound defensive. "Manifest says 34,000. Checked the straps myself. Nothing but lumber." The man grunted, gave the tires a kick. "Looks normal enough." He scrolled on his pad, barely glancing at the trailer. "Probably just the scale. Weather messes with it sometimes." "You're clear. Try not to stop again till you're over the border." Cole nodded, relieved but unsettled, and rumbled back onto the highway.
The sensation only worsened as he drove. Every mile seemed to glue the rig more firmly to the road. The engine worked harder on the shallow grades, gears whined, and every time he hit a bump, the suspension groaned in protest. Cole kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see a blown tire or a loose strap, but everything behind him was shadows and road spray, ordinary as ever. He flicked on the CB, hoping for the comfort of another driver's voice, but only static whispered back. The loneliness of the road pressed in, heavier than the rain-soaked dark outside. At the next exit, desperate for a break and a fresh look at his rig, he pulled into a deserted rest area ringed with dying lamps. Cole walked the length of the trailer, boots squelching in the wet gravel. He scanned the steel undercarriage for signs of tampering or something snagged. The locks were intact, seals unbroken. He pried open a maintenance hatch with his flashlight. Nothing inside but cold metal and shadow. He circled twice, convinced he was missing something obvious, but every check came up empty. Back in the cab, a shiver lingered on his skin. The cab's heat struggled against the chill that seemed to radiate from the trailer itself. He held his hands over the vents, watching his breath fog the windshield, an old unease worming through his thoughts. The heavy, watchful silence reminded him of childhood, the way he'd felt walking past the old graveyard at the edge of town, an instinctive knowledge that something unseen was paying attention. As he sat there, he noticed condensation beading on the inside of the sleeper window, trickling down in cold, trembling lines. His breath caught. It felt like someone else had just exhaled in the dark behind him. Cole spun in his seat, heart hammering, but the cab was empty. Only his lunch bag, his logbook, and his battered thermos, nothing more. He started the engine, eager to outrun his own nerves. As the truck pulled onto the highway, the weight pressed down harder. The dashboard lights dimmed, and the radio sputtered out, leaving the cab so silent he could hear the ticking of the cooling engine and the faint scrape of branches as he skirted a low-hanging stand of willows. Miles later, as dawn threatened somewhere beyond the clouds, he saw movement in the side mirror, a flutter of white in the dark, gone before he could focus. A trick of the light,
maybe. Or a plastic bag caught by the wind. He shook his head, jaw set, and pressed on. The third way station appeared in the faintest blue of false morning, perched at the edge of a wooded ravine. Cole's nerves screamed as he rolled onto the scale, this time the readout swinging instantly to a figure nearly double what it should have been. Alarms buzzed in the office. The weighmaster came out, face tight with suspicion. "We're gonna need to check that trailer, sir," the man said, tapping the clipboard with a gloved finger. "Stay in the cab, please." Cole watched as two men circled the trailer, opening doors, checking locks, shining flashlights into every shadow. Their voices floated back, nothing out of place, all standard. "Doesn't make sense." After several tense minutes, the men waved him over. "Your load's all here. Straps are solid, but something's up with the weight. You see or hear anything strange on your run tonight?" Cole hesitated. "Just feels heavy, that's all." The weighmaster gave him a long hard look. "Happens sometimes, out on these roads. Could be the scale, could be the night. Watch yourself, all right." As Cole pulled away, sweat slicked his palms. The sky brightened, but the air grew colder. Somewhere behind him, the trailer seemed to sink lower, as if the very road itself was struggling under the weight of all that couldn't be seen. The sky lightened with a grudging, sickly dawn, as Cole pressed on, feeling the truck strain beneath him, as if he'd picked up a mountain somewhere back in the night. The world outside was washed out and unreal, the fields pale with mist, the trees along the highway frozen and brittle in the first gray light. He tried to convince himself it was almost over, that sunrise would bring clarity, but with every mile, the Peterbilt labored harder, groaning as if hauling something far heavier than wood. The weight settled not just on his trailer, but in his mind. He couldn't shake the memory of the weighmaster's suspicious stare, the way the numbers had swung far beyond logic, or the cold breath inside his cab at the last rest stop. Now, as the wheels drummed the road, Cole began to notice other things, a new set of sounds, subtle but persistent. At first, it was just a deep creaking, like boards shifting underfoot. Then came a dull rhythmic thump, as if something large was moving inside the trailer. Cole's fingers whitened on the wheel. He flicked his eyes to the mirrors. Shadows stretched along the trailer's length, the pine beams stacked in neat unmoving rows. But in the wavering dawn, those shadows seemed to squirm and multiply, pooling in the spaces between the logs. He could have sworn he saw something, someone, shift in the gloom, just out of the corner of his eye. He swallowed, jaw clenched tight. "Get a grip," he muttered, but his voice was barely a whisper. The CB crackled suddenly, making him jump. For the first time all night, it broke the silence, not with the familiar banter of truckers, but with a garbled voice so distant and old, it sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Don't look back." Cole's hands trembled. He reached for the mic, desperate for human contact. "Breaker 19, anyone out there? You copy?" Nothing but static answered. The air in the cab seemed to freeze, and a faint rattling came from the sleeper behind him, like someone shivering under the blankets. The road narrowed, twisting through a stretch of dense pine. Cole forced himself to keep his eyes forward, but every instinct screamed at him to stop, to check the cargo, to make sure there wasn't something or someone back there. But the warning from the CB echoed in his mind. He gripped the wheel and pressed the gas, desperate to get to the next town, to daylight, to safety. Then the sounds changed. It was no longer just a thump or a creak. There were muffled voices now, too faint to make out, but urgent, pleading, as if a crowd were packed into the trailer, calling out for help from behind layers of wood and steel. A chill raced through Cole's spine. He tried to convince himself it was the tires throwing gravel, the wind catching a loose tarp, but he knew better. He could hear the words forming, desperate and sorrowful, like prayers lost to the roar of the road.
His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror just for a second and saw faces staring back at him, pressed to the dirty glass at the trailer's front wall. faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, lips moving in soundless pleas. Cole's heart seized. He tore his gaze away, nearly swerving into the oncoming lane. Sweat slicked his brow, cold as river water. "No," he whispered. "No, it's just the road, just the night. I'm tired, that's all." But the illusion was impossible to shake now. He could feel them. The weight in the trailer wasn't lumber anymore, but memory, sorrow, the restless press of lives unfinished. He fumbled for the radio again, voice breaking. "Anyone out here? Please, this is Cole, on northbound 23. My rig's acting up. Something's wrong." For a breath, he thought he heard an answer, the same voice as before, weary and resigned. "Keep your eyes ahead, don't stop. Some loads, you just carry." The message fizzled, swallowed by static. Cole wanted to pull over, to run, to throw open the trailer doors, and let the daylight in. The thought filled him with dread. What if he found something he could never explain? What if the trailer was empty, but the weight remained? He kept driving, fists locked on the wheel. Every mile felt harder than the last. The world outside growing brighter, but colder. The road stretching on, as if it might never end. The voices faded to soft sobs, and the faces vanished from the mirror. But the heaviness lingered, a burden, pressing him into the driver's seat. Far ahead, the sign for a familiar town appeared through the fog. Cole felt a surge of hope, but in the trailer behind him, something groaned, the sound heavy as the grave, and the rig dipped lower, as if to remind him, some weights can't be left behind. Cole's knuckles were white on the wheel, as the town's edge finally slid into view. A gas station, a battered sign for a diner, a blinking yellow light. Civilization, if only by inches. But he didn't feel relief. The engine still labored beneath him, the truck riding so low it scraped every bump and dip in the cracked pavement. Even the sidewalks looked wary, the early morning gloom thick as a secret. He forced himself to pull over, near the town's tiny police substation, parking under the flickering glow of a lamp. The brakes hissed, the whole rig settling with a groan that seemed more pained than mechanical. Cole sat for a minute, heart pounding, staring at the empty street. He was afraid to step out, afraid to stay put. The cold seeped through the glass, and in the rear view, he swore he saw a fleeting shadow drift past the trailer doors. Before he could talk himself out of it, a cruiser rolled up, the officer inside eyeing Cole's rig with suspicion. The door opened, and a woman in a sheriff's jacket stepped out, coffee in hand. She nodded at Cole, then glanced at the trailer with a furrowed brow. "Morning, driver. Trouble?" Cole swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, my load keeps weighing heavy, real heavy. Been through 2 stations, and it just gets worse. They told me to stop if I could. I'm not sure what's happening." The sheriff studied him, then flicked her gaze to the trailer. "Hauling what? Lumber?" Cole replied, voice thin. "Same as always. Checked it myself. I can show you the manifest. Let's take a look." She walked slowly around the rig, boots crunching gravel. Cole followed, feeling the morning chill gnaw at his bones. The sheriff ran her hand along the cold metal, eyes narrowing. "You checked the doors?" Cole nodded. He fumbled with the padlock, the key rattling, as if the steel itself was shivering. The doors creaked open, the scent of fresh pine spilling into the air. Rows of timber sat exactly as they had at the mill, strapped tight, undisturbed. The sheriff peered inside, shined her flashlight along the floorboards and corners, then stepped back, frowning. "Doesn't look over limit to me. You got a hidden compartment, illegals, stowaways?" Cole shook his head, panic crawling up his throat. "No ma'am, nothing like that." I caused, unable to finish. How could he explain the faces in the mirror, the phantom voices, the chill that had followed him all night? The sheriff closed the doors and scribbled something on her notepad. "Let's weigh it again.
We've got a local scale. Cole maneuvered the rig to the station's battered platform, every movement feeling wrong, leaden, as if the road itself was pushing against him. The digital readout flickered to life, numbers higher than any legal load, higher even than what he'd seen at dawn. The sheriff's jaw tightened. That can't be right, she muttered. She circled the trailer again, this time slower, knuckles tapping against the metal sides. Cole shivered, feeling watched. He remembered the voice on the radio. Don't look back. But the urge to see, to know what he was carrying, was almost overwhelming. As the sheriff turned away, Cole glanced back at the trailer. In the slanting light, he thought he saw movement, a flicker between the stacks of timber, a shifting of shadow that made the hair on his neck stand up. He blinked hard, and it was gone. All right, step out, the sheriff ordered, pulling her radio. She called in the wait, voice low and urgent. 2 more officers arrived, all business, opening up the back, tapping on the wood, even bringing in a drug dog that sniffed and whined, but found nothing. One cop muttered, "Cold in there," rubbing his arms. No secret cargo, no drugs, no extra load, but the weight was real, the numbers undeniable. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The sheriff asked, "You seen or heard anything strange on the road, Cole?" He almost laughed, the sound sharp and desperate. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." She studied him, her gaze less official now, more human. "Try me." Cole hesitated, then blurted it all. The creeping weight, the faces in the glass, the whispers, the icy breath, the sense that the dead were following him. The officers listened in silence. No one interrupted. When he finished, the youngest of the 3 just crossed himself. The sheriff nodded, almost thoughtful. "You know this road's old, right? Lot of wrecks, lot of folks never found. Every few years a trucker comes in with a load like yours, heavy with something nobody can see." She looked at Cole, her voice gentle. "Maybe it's not just lumber you're carrying."
He stared, shivering in the morning light, the burden of the trailer heavier than ever. For the first time, he wondered if he could ever be free of it, or if the weight would ride with him, mile after mile, until he joined the shadows on the road. Cole sat slumped on the curb, elbows on his knees, staring at the puddles, oil-slicked by the rising sun. His rig squatted behind him, shadowed and silent, its bulk a dark shape on the edge of the waking town. The sheriff and her deputies drifted away, radios crackling, glancing back with the wary respect reserved for the haunted or the mad. The dog, sensing more than its handler could, kept whining, circling the trailer, before finally settling at Cole's feet with a low, uncertain growl. The cold wouldn't leave him, even as sunlight touched his face. It was deeper than weather, woven into his bones now. He clutched the cup of bad coffee someone had pressed into his hand, not drinking, only letting the steam sting his skin. His mind reeled with the sheriff's words, the echo of her voice. "Maybe it's not just lumber you're carrying." He'd heard of ghost stories on the road, of haunted diners and phantom hitchhikers, but those had always seemed like somebody else's legend, until now. The truck was his burden. The weight was his, whatever rode in the darkness with him. It was a secret only the night and a handful of lost souls might understand. As the town came alive, Cole found himself walking, as if pulled, toward the edge of the square. There, by the faded brick of a closed gas station, stood a little roadside memorial, plastic flowers, weathered candles, a cracked wooden cross hammered into the ground. He remembered the sheriff's mention of old wrecks, of people who never made it home. The names were faded by rain, but one, a girl, maybe 16, missing 30 years, caught his eye. Next to it, a line of coins, offerings left by travelers in a hurry. Someone had left a child's toy truck, red paint, chipped to metal. Cole knelt, rough hands trembling. He fished in his pocket, came up with an old lighter,
and set it beside the flowers. He bowed his head, unsure what prayer to offer, so he just let silence fill the space. The wind picked up, sifting dust and road grit over his boots. Something inside his chest seemed to shift, a subtle, impossible lessening of pressure, as if a great hand had unclenched. The cold that had clung to him all night loosened. For the first time, he realized he could breathe easy. Back at his truck, Cole climbed into the cab and found the heater humming strong, warm air chasing the chill from his limbs. He put his hands on the wheel. The rig sat higher now, suspension springing the way it had back at the mill. It felt lighter, almost nimble. He checked the mirrors. The morning looked ordinary, the trailer empty of shadows. He started the engine, and the radio came alive, clear and strong, blaring a country tune he knew by heart. The CB snapped and popped with chatter, just truckers, laughing about roadkill and radar traps. The regular world returned. Cole grinned in spite of himself, let the warmth roll through him. As he pulled away from town, the sun rose in full, burning the mist from the fields. He watched the memorial shrink in the side mirror, its flowers bright in the new light. At the town's edge, he passed another trucker, fueling up, a stranger with tired eyes. Their gaze met, for a second, a flicker of recognition passing between them. The stranger nodded, a silent understanding. We all carry something. Miles down the road, Cole glanced at the weight ticket he'd been given in town. The numbers were right. The load was normal again, legal and ordinary, as wood and paperwork. He looked at the empty seat beside him, half expecting a face in the glass, a whisper in the dawn, but there was nothing except the hum of the tires and the long open road ahead. Still, some part of him stayed alert. He knew now that the highway held more than asphalt and rain. There were old stories and restless souls waiting to be remembered. Each way station, each lonely stretch, could bring something unseen: guilt, memory, sorrow, or hope. Cole promised himself he'd leave an offering at every memorial from here on out. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was a way to lighten the load, for himself and for those who couldn't ride on. He passed a final sign marking the county line. The engine purred, the trailer rode smooth. Sunlight flickered through the windshield, and Cole felt, maybe for the first time since the beginning of the long night, a peace he couldn't name. Whatever weight he'd carried, he'd let it go, at least for now. But as he drove into the day, he couldn't help but glance in the mirror, knowing the road was never empty, and that some stories keep riding along, waiting for the next traveler to feel their burden.
After 13 hours behind the wheel, the only thing Brett wanted was sleep. The night had gone slick and black, rain hissing along the interstate, puddles flashing like dark glass in the orange blink of his marker lights. He'd pushed past the state line, past 3 closed rest stops and 1 overflowing lot, until he found the kind of place every trucker learns to look for: quiet, overlooked, the lot mostly empty, except for a few tired rigs settled under the bare glare of security lamps. Brett pulled in slow, scanning for movement, just habit, learned after a decade of midnight stops in places that felt both safe and not. He killed the headlights, rolled up his windows against the drizzle, and double-checked the locks before he slid out of the seat and stretched, stiff joints popping. The air was wet and cold enough to creep through denim, carrying the smell of diesel, wet gravel, and distant pine. He did a lazy walk around, checking tires, listening to the truck settle, his breath plumed in the air. No one else stirred. One rig had a dog tied out front, another's cab light glowed blue as a TV flickered inside, but no faces. He liked it that way. Brett climbed back in, locked up, and drew the curtain to the sleeper. The cab was his sanctuary, a world shrunk to a steel cocoon, half buried in blankets, and the muffled hum of rain on the roof. Brett peeled off his boots, kicked them against the footwell,
and crawled into the narrow bunk. He propped his phone on the side shelf and set his alarm for dawn. Then he let himself sink into the heavy, exhausted comfort of sleep. It might have been minutes or hours later. Time got strange after a run like this, when Brett woke to a strange heaviness pressing against his back. At first he thought it was the cheap mattress, the way the foam always sagged toward the center. He shifted, trying to get comfortable, but the weight didn't budge. Instead, it seemed to mold to him, as if someone lay curled right behind him, their body pressed to his spine, their breath cold and slow against his neck. Brett froze, mind swimming up through layers of groggy disbelief. He listened, nothing but the faint tap of rain on the roof, the low gurgle of the heater fan, no footsteps, no whispered voices from the lot outside. He tried to move, but the sensation lingered, a dense, unfamiliar pressure, both physical and somehow not. His heart thudded faster. It had to be a dream. He forced himself to roll over, half expecting to see a shadow, a shape, something lurking in the blue glow of his phone screen. The bunk was empty. The blanket had slipped down, leaving his shoulder exposed to the chill. Brett's own breath fogged the air. The cold spot where he'd felt the weight was icy against his skin. He lay back, jaw tight, telling himself it was nothing, just exhaustion, sleep paralysis, maybe a muscle cramp, or the ghost memory of someone's embrace years ago. Still, as he pulled the covers back up, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mattress had held more than his own weight. Sleep didn't come easy the second time. Brett listened to the world outside, the distant highway noise, the whine of a reefer kicking on in the next rig over, the drumming of rain growing lighter. As the storm moved off, he replayed what he'd felt, searching for logic. Maybe he'd dreamed it. Maybe his mind was playing tricks, lonely, and stretched thin from too many miles, and not enough conversation. He rolled over again, eyes scanning the cramped shadows of the cab. The phone's clock glowed, 3:14 a.m. He dozed off and on until dawn, never fully relaxed. Every time he drifted close to sleep, a prickling sense of unease dragged him halfway back to waking. The empty part of the bunk stayed cold, as if someone had just left, or might return at any moment. When the alarm finally buzzed, Brett blinked blearily at the thin line of gray outside the curtain. He stretched, checked his messages, and forced himself up, joints aching, mouth dry. He tried to laugh at himself as he dressed, but the sound was flat. He bundled up, stepped into the damp morning, and did another slow walk around the truck, finding nothing out of place. No footprints, no sign that anyone had come or gone. Brett shook his head. "Need to get out of my own head," he muttered, and tried to write it off as a trucker's bad dream, just another long night. But as he climbed back into the cab and reached for his boots, he found the blanket pulled down to the far edge of the mattress, exactly where he remembered feeling the weight beside him. A chill traced his spine. He shook it off, told himself it was nothing, and fired up the engine. Yet as he pulled onto the highway, glancing back at the narrow bunk in the rear view, Brett couldn't help but wonder if last night's loneliness had truly belonged to him alone. Brett promised himself it had just been a dream, a vivid, strange one, nothing more. The morning miles unwound beneath his tires, and he tried to lose the chill in the familiar patterns of the road, the rhythm of mile markers, the chorus of trucker banter on the CB, the comfort of coffee warming his hands. But every now and then, he'd glance at the sleeper's curtain in the mirror, as if half expecting it to shift, to see an outline where there should be none. That night, he found a truck stop with more lights, more people. It was loud, and the air in the diner was thick with the smell of fried onions and spilled diesel. He chatted with a waitress, swapped jokes with a couple of other drivers at the counter, and stayed out longer than usual. He wanted to outrun the memory of that cold shape beside him, to fill the hours with anything but silence. Finally, fatigue won. Brett walked out to the lot, weaving through a maze of running engines and flickering tail lights. His truck felt familiar, safe, almost under the orange glow of the pole lamps. He checked every lock, peered into the sleeper as if he might find someone waiting, but it was empty. Still, he hesitated before crawling in. He left the curtain open and kept a small lamp burning, as if light could ward off whatever haunted his nerves.
He lay in the bunk, phone in hand, scrolling through news stories and social feeds, messages from home, photos of his nephew, a friend's joke. The world beyond the cab felt distant, almost unreal. The engine's idle was a steady lullaby, and before he knew it, his eyes were drifting closed. It was deep in the night when Brett woke, heart thrumming, cold sweat slicking his forehead. The feeling was back, heavier now, unmistakable. Something was pressed up against him, warm and solid, and not his own. He froze, breath shallow, afraid to move. He listened, heard nothing but his own panicked pulse and the faint rumble of a passing reefer unit. But the sensation remained, a presence beside him, a slight shifting of weight, as if someone was rolling over in their sleep. He forced himself to reach out, hand trembling. His palm met the mattress. No one, just a deep hollow in the foam, a perfect shape, as if another body had lain there all night. He flinched and jerked his hand back, breath catching. The air in the sleeper was cold, and a faint scent, old cologne, sweet and powdery, hung where there should have been only the smell of engine oil and sweat. Brett sat up, clicking on the overhead light. The empty space beside him looked unchanged, but the blanket was rumpled, tugged loose from the foot of the bed. He felt for his phone, checked the time, 2:49 a.m. He stared at the screen, hoping for some logical explanation, but dread clung to him. He got up and checked the door, lock still set tight. He looked through the cab, nothing out of place, no footprints on the mat, no sign of an intruder, only the fading chill in the sleeper, and the lingering whiff of cologne, as if someone had just left. Unable to sleep, Brett pulled on his jacket and stepped out onto the lot. The world was hushed, only a handful of trucks left idling under the stars. He walked past the other cabs, their windows glowing blue or dark, their drivers lost in dreams or loneliness. He considered knocking on someone's door, asking if they'd ever felt something strange on the road, but the words felt foolish in his mouth. Instead, he paced, letting the night air clear his mind. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him back inside. He lay in the bunk, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for every little sound. The cold in the mattress faded, and morning crept in. When the sun finally rose, Brett hadn't really slept at all. He spent the next day on edge. Every so often, he'd catch a whiff of that sweet cologne, never strong, but enough to make his scalp prickle. The blanket was always a little off, the bunk a little colder than it should be. He shook himself, told himself it was nerves, that he was reading meaning into nothing. But that night, parked in a lonely pull-off beside an old grain elevator, Brett found himself dreading sleep. He tried to keep the radio on, read a magazine, anything to stay awake. When he finally gave in, exhaustion swallowing fear, he lay tense and alert, waiting for the feeling. He didn't have to wait long. As he drifted, the mattress dipped. This time, he was sure something or someone settled beside him, a gentle pressure curling at his back, not hostile, just there. He thought he heard the faintest sigh, like the wind slipping through a cracked window. Brett squeezed his eyes shut. He told himself he was only tired, only dreaming. But in the last moment before sleep claimed him, he knew he was not alone in the dark, and he had no idea what would come next. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, a half-waking dream, nerves, too many late nights, and too many stories traded over bottomless coffee.
But the third night it happened. Brett could not dismiss it. He parked far from the others, in a dark corner of a rest area, thinking maybe proximity to crowds had made him jumpy before. Maybe, he told himself, he just needed solitude to reset. But the cab felt wrong the moment he shut the door behind him. The air was stale and cold, and the sleeper bunk seemed to loom in the gloom, expectant and already occupied by an invisible weight. He checked the lock 3 times, left his boots on the mat, stripped down to boxers and a t-shirt, and crawled under the covers. He brought a paperback into bed, reading by the light of his phone, until his eyes burned. But every sound seemed magnified: the drip of rain off the trailer, the distant yelp of a coyote, the muffled groan of his bunk's springs. Sleep, when it came, was uneasy. He woke once with a start, convinced he'd heard a soft, deliberate breath right at his ear. He lay rigid, eyes wide, waiting for the next sign: a touch, a sigh, a word. The silence pressed in. Just when he convinced himself it was only his imagination, he felt it, a hand, or something like it, pressing gently against his back. It was not cold, not icy as he expected, but a steady, insistent pressure. He didn't dare move, hardly breathed. Then the hand was gone, replaced by the familiar sensation of another presence stretched out behind him, spooned up, as if he were sharing the bunk with a silent, unseen companion. The hair at his nape prickled. He could hear a faint, steady breathing that matched his own, but just out of sync. He lay awake for what felt like hours. At some point, exhaustion won out, dragging him into a black, dreamless sleep. Morning came as a relief, but brought its own questions. He woke shivering, the blankets pushed almost entirely off him, one corner of the bed indented, as if someone had just gotten up. On the sheet near his pillow, he found a small mother-of-pearl button, old, scuffed at the edge, nothing like the fasteners on his own shirts. He picked it up, holding it in the morning light. It was icy cold, and as he turned it over in his hand, a faint trace of cologne clung to his fingertips. Brett dressed quickly, restless and rattled. He nearly threw the button away, but pocketed it instead, needing proof he wasn't losing his mind. He tried to push through his route as normal, fueling up, checking tires, letting the miles roll beneath him. At a truck stop lunch counter, he almost asked the driver next to him, "Ever have a bunkmate you couldn't see?" But he swallowed the words. He was afraid of the look he'd get, afraid it might make the strangeness real.
That night, he parked in a crowded chain truck plaza, determined to break the pattern. He propped his phone in the corner, set a podcast to play, and left every light on in the cab. He lay back, arms crossed over his chest, waiting. The hours stretched, long and slow. The bunk was warm from his body, the cab filled with the comforting buzz of voices from the speakers. He almost believed he'd won. Then, at 2:21 a.m., the lights flickered, and the podcast sputtered into static. The mattress dipped behind him, gentle but unmistakable. He felt the press of a body curl close, almost protective, as if his presence was as comforting to the other as theirs was unsettling to him. A soft, unfamiliar voice, muffled by sleep or distance, murmured something at his ear. He couldn't make out the words, but the sadness in them was clear. When he woke, it was with a sense of loss, like someone had left in the night. The cab smelled faintly sweet, not unpleasant, and the air was clear and fresh. He found another oddity on the bunk, a faded bobby pin tangled in the blanket, not his, not recent. He was shaken but less afraid now. Whatever haunted his sleep was not angry, not trying to harm him. He began to wonder, who was it? A lost driver, a hitchhiker who'd never made it home? Did his truck carry memories older than his own years at the wheel? Brett turned the mother-of-pearl button over in his palm, feeling its weight, the odd comfort of the cold metal. He stared at the empty bunk and whispered, "Who are you?" But the only answer was the soft tick of the engine cooling, and the hush of the road waiting for dawn. The next day, Brett's restlessness grew. The bobby pin and the old button weighed heavy in his pocket, their existence impossible to rationalize. He kept turning them in his hand as he drove, mind drifting to every strange tale he'd ever heard: ghost hitchhikers, phantom riders, old trucks that ran themselves out of the yard at midnight. He wondered who else had felt this: the cold press of someone not there, the faintest trace of perfume, or a voice nearly lost to the hum of tires. He stopped early that evening, parking his rig in the golden glow of dusk at a quiet truck stop outside an old river town. He needed answers, or at least the comfort of other voices. Inside the cafe, the air was warm and dense with the smell of coffee and onion rings. The booths were scattered with a few other drivers, eyes hollowed by miles, stories etched into their faces. He found an empty stool at the counter and nursed a cup of black coffee. After a while, he turned to the man beside him, a weathered driver with a Texas drawl and a face like worn leather. "Ever feel like you're not alone in your bunk?" Brett asked, keeping his voice low. "Like there's someone else right there with you?" The old-timer looked at him a long moment, then nodded, slow and solemn. "Happens more than folks care to admit, kid. My brother used to talk about a woman who'd show up in his cab on cold nights. Never saw her, but he felt her there. Found an earring once, years after his divorce. He swore he heard her crying." Brett exhaled, some of his fear loosening. He told his own story, waking to a body pressed against his back, the strange objects left behind, the chill that wouldn't fade. The man listened, eyes distant, nodding along. "These roads hold memories," the old-timer said quietly. "Some say the lonesome ones stick around, looking for a ride, or a little warmth on the way out. Could be you got a spirit riding shotgun, one that remembers the cab even better than you." Another driver joined in, her voice softer. "Heard stories about trucks passed down after bad wrecks. Sometimes folks say a lost driver keeps coming back, out of habit. There's a story from the 80s, woman driver killed in a pileup outside Memphis. They say her perfume still lingers on the bunks of anyone who gets her old rig." Brett asked about his own truck, whether its history might explain the haunting. The waitress, eavesdropping as she topped off his mug, chimed in, "You should check for old stuff, tucked under seats, behind the mattress. Sometimes folks leave pieces of themselves behind." That night, Brett returned to his rig, nerves thrumming. He pulled apart the sleeper, digging under the mattress, shining his flashlight in every shadowed corner. It was there, tucked behind a panel, above the headboard, a faded photograph, creased and nearly worn through. A woman stood in front of a cab, arm around a young man in a driver's uniform, both laughing, sun bright on their faces. On the back, written in looping pen, were the words, "See you down the road, K&T." His heart pounded. Maybe his truck had belonged to one of them, years ago. Maybe one of them had never made it home. That night, Brett couldn't resist. He laid the button, the bobby pin, and the photograph on the shelf beside his bunk. He spoke softly into the darkness, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who you are, but I know you're here. Maybe you're just looking for company. Maybe you're just lonely." The cab felt warmer than before. When he settled into the bunk, the cold wasn't as sharp. Sleep came easily, and when he woke, it was to the gentle pressure of a hand in his, comforting and calm. No fear, no chill, just the unmistakable sense that someone was there, keeping watch with him through the hours before dawn. As sunlight crept in, Brett opened his eyes to find the photograph still on the shelf, but the button and bobby pin were gone. In their place, a single white daisy had been left, a fresh bloom where nothing living should have survived the night. He picked it up, feeling gratitude outweigh fear. Maybe his visitor had found what she was searching for, or maybe she just wanted to be remembered. Either way, Brett smiled and whispered, "Thank you," before turning the key
and letting the road carry them both a little farther into the day. The daisy sat on Brett's dash all day, a quiet promise that what he'd experienced was more than some feverish string of dreams. He caught himself glancing at it as the miles rolled by, half waiting for it to wilt or fade, but the petals stayed crisp and white, as if they'd been plucked that morning from a sunlit field, rather than conjured out of thin air in the gloom of a truck stop night. It became an anchor for him, proof that the world was stranger, and sometimes gentler than he'd thought.
He finished his deliveries without incident, though every night he found himself lingering in the cab a little longer, speaking softly into the darkness as he settled in. "You still here?" he'd ask, or "Good night, friend." Sometimes, if he let himself drift at the edge of sleep, he'd feel the faintest shift of the mattress, a sigh like wind through tall grass, or the warm weight of a hand resting on his shoulder, never frightening now, only companionable. He kept the old photograph tucked above his head, tucked behind the cab light. The faces in it became familiar. He found himself thinking of them as friends, wondering about their story. Had the woman ever made it home? Had the man in the uniform finished his run? Or did the road swallow him the way it threatened to swallow them all, eventually? It was easier now to believe in a world that held on to such stories, a world where loneliness and longing lingered like perfume in the air. One chilly morning, after a week of quiet runs and peaceful sleep, Brett stopped at the river town, where he'd first heard other drivers' stories. He left the daisy on the edge of the cafe's counter with a silent nod to the waitress, who only smiled in a knowing way, as if these things happened more often than most cared to admit. Later, he bought a new pack of coffee for the next driver, leaving it at the trucker's lounge with a note, "For the road, from someone who knows what it's like to ride with company." That night, parked under a sky full of spring stars, Brett realized the cab felt bigger, lighter. He stretched out in the bunk, feeling only his own weight, and slept dreamlessly until dawn. When he woke, the photograph remained, but nothing else. No bobby pins, no buttons, no trace of his unseen guest, except the piece she'd left behind. But the road is long, and sometimes, on the edge of sleep, the old feelings would return. He'd sense the warmth of another soul beside him, especially on lonely highways or cold wind-rattled nights. He grew to cherish it, the reminder that every driver was part of something larger than himself, that the cab was never quite empty, that the miles could carry not just freight, but stories and memories, dreams and old heartbreaks. Brett found himself listening more closely at truck stops, buying coffee for solitary drivers, asking about the ones who never made it home. Some folks shared their own strange stories, a photograph that kept returning, the ghost of a child's laugh in an empty cab, headlights trailing them for hours before vanishing without a trace. Each tale layered onto the road's invisible history, a patchwork of longing and loss, hope and haunting. He began to look forward to those quiet nights, when the moon was high and the world went silent. He'd settle in, whisper good night, and sometimes, just sometimes, he'd feel the gentle pressure of a presence curling up close, a soft sigh, a moment of belonging that made the vastness of the world seem smaller. One spring evening, months after the daisy, Brett parked by a little cemetery overlooking the prairie, the grass waving like a sea in the golden dusk. He left the photo at the gate, tucked under a stone angel's wing, and said a quiet goodbye. "Rest easy," he whispered. "You rode with me as long as you needed." That night, his bunk was empty, but his heart was full. The loneliness of the road was still there, miles to go, towns to leave behind, and sunrises to chase, but it was changed, colored by the kindness of a stranger who had only asked to be remembered. As Brett rolled through the darkness, his cab warm and his mind at peace, he understood that not all passengers need a seatbelt or a name. Some just needed a place to rest, for a night or a while, before moving on down the road.
And sometimes, when the night was quietest, and the hum of the tires lulled him toward dreams, Brett would smile and say softly, "Good night, friend. See you down the road."